Hi, I'm Colleen Taylor with TechCrunch TV. Here with me today via Skype is Gary Reback, who is probably Silicon Valley's most well-respected and premier antitrust lawyers for the past 3 decades. He's well known especially for his work against Microsoft's monopoly in the 1990s. And today we're talking to him about the lawsuit filed by the US Department of Justice against Apple and 5 major publishers, alleging that there is some price fixing that has happened over the past few years in the ebook space. So welcome, Gary. Thank you for talking to us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Colleen.
And so just to dive right in, can you tell me the way that you're reading this situation, what is happening, what happened today with the Department of Justice and Apple and the ebook publishers?
Yes, this has been anticipated for a while. Apparently, according to the complaint that has officially been filed, there's been a conspiracy going on for a couple of years now in the publishing industry, and according to the complaint, it's a conspiracy that involves Apple, and it affects many, many consumers because it affects the price of all the ebooks that are sold basically in the United States. We've heard for a while now, and the press has reported, that there have been settlement negotiations going on, and indeed we understand today that a couple of the publishers have settled, even though they're named in the complaint. No relief will be sought against them. But Apple and a couple of the other publishers are holding out, so a complaint has been officially filed. It will be assigned to a judge, and they'll move forward toward a trial.
And I know you wrote a book a few years ago called Free the Market, and your main sort of argument there is that government regulation is necessary, especially in the tech space, as things develop so quickly in the technology industry, to kind of keep things fair and open. Is this evidence that, you know, the government and the Department of Justice is actually more on top of things than maybe they've been in previous years?
Well, I do think that the Department of Justice has taken it upon itself to get more on top of things. There was a recent convention, a big antitrust convention in Washington, D.C., where the principal signatory to this complaint, Joe Whalen, made it clear that the Department of Justice is not afraid to litigate against big companies and will be litigating more in the future. Now, in this particular situation, though, they've known about this conduct for quite a while. And indeed, I discussed it with them back during the time of the Google book settlement, which was a couple of years ago, although I'm not involved in the lawsuit in any respect. So they've known about this for a while, and it's taken them a couple of years to get a complaint on file. Nevertheless, it's important not just for the participants, but it's very important for the technology sector in ways we'll discuss here.
And so let's dive right into that. What can the larger technology sector take away from this? Because Apple, of course, is a big name and everyone's interested in that, but the rest of the subjects in this lawsuit are in the publishing industry, which is not really part of the tech sector.
Well, that's right. But this lawsuit does show how computer technology and digitization is moving through the rest of the economy, and specifically raises the question of how the players in the older sectors of the economy are going to respond to these changes in technology. Frankly, I think that the biggest impact of what you saw today won't be on Apple or even on the book publishers. It will be on the big New York advertising agencies in connection with the Google investigation, the investigation that the Federal Trade Commission and the various states have going on against Google. You see, the big New York publishers can now see what happens if they don't act the right way. They saw what happened to the recording industry when Apple came in and began to dominate that industry. Now, the big book publishers were afraid of Amazon, and so according to our government, they did exactly the wrong thing. They not only got their business trashed, but they ended up being the subject of a government lawsuit against conspiracy. So my prediction from this particular lawsuit is that it will serve as a wake-up call to the New York publishers, I'm sorry, to the New York advertisers and advertising agencies, and they'll get more involved and more public with respect to the FTC's investigation of Google.
So rather than having this, because it seems like maybe these publishers had this thought of, we saw what happened to the music industry, and if we can't beat them, we should join them. But then that ended up hurting them. And so you're saying maybe advertisers should now think a minute longer before they decide to go and join Google in online advertising?
I think that the advertisers fear Google much as the book publishers feared Amazon and the recording industry feared Apple. Right now, the big New York advertisers have the opportunity to be on the government side as it moves against Google. But if they don't take advantage of that opportunity, they may end up like the book publishers in this case, being a subject of the investigation as opposed to being a proponent of the investigation.
And I know you mentioned that you're not personally involved as a lawyer in this particular case, but do you have any idea of how much money could be at play here, what the settlements could possibly entail, or if it does end up going to trial, how much this could cost for Apple and the publishers?
Well, this is a civil lawsuit. The Department of Justice can also bring criminal lawsuits, but they decided not to do that in this case. I think the biggest financial implication is that if there is a trial and a finding in favor of the government, there are going to be a lot of private actions, plaintiffs' actions for treble damages going to this conspiracy, which according to the pleadings lasted a couple of years and substantially raised the price of ebooks from less than $10 to, in some cases, $16. So I think that's what you're going to see a lot of. And I would hasten to say, I don't think that what happens here will have a material effect on Apple or its business. I mean, Apple is, after all, doing quite well. It can afford to deal with this lawsuit in financial terms. The book publishers, on the other hand, are in a different situation. I mean, their business model is far more precarious. And they're going to have to be living not only with a difficult business model, but also with a lot of lawsuits for a very long time.
And as I mentioned earlier, you've been in this space for a long time here in Silicon Valley, working in antitrust law. How do you see the larger landscape in general right now?
Well, in terms of antitrust enforcement, just within the last year, things have really begun to perk up. We're in a transitional mode, and we've had some new leadership in the Department of Justice Antitrust Division. The chairman of the Federal Trade Commission has recently gotten reconfirmed. And so the government enforcement agencies, and we don't like to think of them as regulators, by the way, Colleen, we think of them as law enforcers. So the enforcement agencies have begun to get a lot more active. Silicon Valley, as you know, is doing quite well right now. We're all anticipating a big IPO from Facebook. Several of the other good companies have gone public, others will. So I think this antitrust enforcement is going to complement our momentum as we continue to grow in the technology sector.
And one last question, just you mentioned Facebook, and I wonder if you see anything, there's a lot of mergers and acquisitions going on in this landscape. Are there any looming antitrust issues when it comes to the social web? Or is that still so early or diversified enough that there won't be any issues here for a while?
Well, I think it's closer to what you suggest at the end of your question. In other words, from what I can see, we still have a lot of investment by venture capitalists and other investors in the social networking space. We have almost no investment in search. And I think that the government is always very concerned about innovation and innovation by smaller disruptive competitors. And so I think that's what's driving in part the investigation of Google. And I don't know that we've gotten to that stage with Facebook at this time. So while Facebook is certainly a big player, I don't see anything in the offing which would suggest a Google-type investigation.
It seems like they'll definitely have their hands full with Google for a while here.
Indeed so. Indeed so. It takes a lot for the government to bring one of these lawsuits and to go to trial. You see on the pleadings what will be the government trial team, but my guess is that they'll have at least a dozen attorneys working on the Apple case that's been filed. And with respect to the Google investigation, between the Federal Trade Commission and the major states that are involved, there are more than 30 attorneys working on that matter. So it is quite a big deal in both cases.
And so it seems like a lot of times people think that the government really lags behind the tech sector, but it seems like they're making a concerted effort right now to show that they're on top of it.
That's true, but the proof is in the pudding. You know, people began to complain about Google more than 2 years ago. And some of those companies, frankly, including companies that I represent, have gone out of business during the time that the government's been looking at this. So I think a lot will depend in terms of perception on how quickly and effectively the Federal Trade Commission moves with respect to Google. That will tell us whether the government's really on top of this or whether they still lag.
Well, Gary Reback, thank you so much for joining us from your office down in Silicon Valley, Carr and Farrell. We really appreciate getting your insights here.
Thanks so much for having me, Colleen.